Hello, everyone. My name is Erica Matsumoto. I lead partnerships for the NYC Media Lab. I am so excited to kick off our third episode of our virtual Machines+Media conference, hosted in partnership between the NYC Media Lab and Bloomberg. Our panel today will focus on tech ethics, diversity, bias, inequality, and privacy. We are really excited to have an amazing panel of thought leaders, startup founders with us here today. So I'd like to first introduce our panel. We have Kathy O'Neill, author of Weapons of Math Destruction, Ian Allen, CEO of Camber Systems, and Riley Jones, CEO of Join the Block. Could we just start with a quick round of introductions? So Kathy, let's start with you.
Sure, yeah, I'd like to start by saying I'm also the CEO of a company I founded, which is an algorithmic auditing company called Orca. So yeah, I wrote a book about, I'm a mathematician by training, then I became a finance quant, and then a data scientist, and I saw like all sorts of terrible things happening that were reminiscent of the things that caused the financial crisis, and I wanted to write about it. So I wrote this book called Weapons of Math Destruction because as I saw it, there were a lot of algorithms that had inherent flaws that were just as bad as the bad algorithms for the AAA rated mortgages, but much harder to detect. The problems they had were, well, I'll talk about them later. So I wrote the book and then I realized that very few people had these skills to audit those algorithms, to make them better. Like, it's easy to complain about something, but it's harder to fix something. So that's why I started Orca. And I'm working very hard on gaining expertise on how to like ask the right questions of algorithms and try to modify them so they're less harmful, or convincing people to stop using them altogether.
Awesome, thank you for that. All right, let's go to Ian.
Hi, pleasure to be here. Thanks everybody. I was in the Marine Corps for 10 years, and then I was in CIA in the Special Activities Division for 7, left in 2012 because I needed to find a grown-up job, and always wanted to start my own company, and helped a friend. He's starting a tech company at the time, worked with him briefly. I also founded a couple of nonprofits, which ended up distracting me for 6 years. But eventually, when those were up and running, was fortunate to get connected with a tremendous venture firm, Hanger in New York, who helped us start Camber Systems last year.
Great, thank you. All right, Riley.
Yeah, so I actually am I guess now a lawyer by training. I just finished law school at NYU, and I did NYC Media Lab's social impact program last year in 2019. And so what Join the Block does is we are a software platform helping workforce organizations in New York City better operationalize their systems. So a lot of what we do relates to NLP. We help people upgrade their resumes to prepare for jobs. In employment, which, as you can probably imagine, is even more exacerbated in terms of the problem now, given the time that we're in. So we're pretty busy day to day, but I'm really excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. We are so excited to have this conversation and really raise awareness around algorithmic bias. And we are so excited to bring together an exciting, amazing panel of all CEO founders, lawyers, and thought leaders. So to begin, let's start by setting the stage. We are currently in an unprecedented global health pandemic and in a moment of reawakening around systemic injustice and hopefully national change. Given all this, let's ask ourselves, why is it important to raise awareness around algorithmic bias and data privacy? Why is it more important than ever? So Kathy, let's start with you. In your book, you coined the term weapons of math destruction. Could you describe that? Could you go into that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, it's sort of like what I started talking about in my introduction. Like I witnessed sort of firsthand, working at a hedge fund in 2007, how like when people overly trust, well, in that case, the AAA ratings on mortgage-backed securities, they trust it because in some sense of the mathematical objective marketing allure that algorithms have. They have sort of this blind faith in it. Then they don't ask questions. Mistakes don't get caught. Mistakes don't get fixed. And in the case of the AAA rated mortgage-backed securities, what happened was a huge housing bubble internationally, which exploded, and like we saw the consequences for years and years. So I call that a weapon of mass destruction internally. It was weaponized, and it was like touted as mathematical objective fact, when in fact it was not at all. It was statistically very weak. In fact, it was a manipulation, a lie, if you will, mathematical lie. Then I went into data science to try to get away from that whole industry. And I was like, wow, this is happening everywhere. And what we're doing here is, instead of predicting the markets, predicting credit instruments like mortgage-backed securities, we are predicting people. We're predicting like whether someone's going to do well in a job, whether someone's going to pay back a loan, whether someone's, et cetera. So, and all these sort of ways that people actually get measured for risk. So for those things like, what are you worthy? Anytime you're being asked by bureaucracy, are you worthy? Are you worthy of this college, of this job, of this insurance policy? Those are being done algorithmically now. And since I was a data scientist doing that kind of thing, albeit in a kind of banal situation of ad tech for traveling, like on, cheaptickets.com or whatever. So in a kind of low stakes situation, but I was like, I know how I'm doing this. And what I'm doing is I'm looking at people's wealth, their gender, their race. And I've decided whether they're worthy based on historical information, like people like you paid back this loan, people like you got a raise. But of course, at the same time, I knew that, like, we didn't choose who to give loans to and mortgages to and raises to based on objective fact at all. We just chose it based on bias, on racism, sexism, and classism. And so I was like, wow, what I'm doing is actually propagating all that stuff. And that's what we're all doing as data scientists. It is maybe mathematical by the way this pattern matching is being discovered, but it is not mathematical in historic fact. It is just propagating past bias. And I saw that happening everywhere. And I also saw the same thing that I'd seen in finance, this blind faith. So to answer your question, a weapon of math destruction is an important algorithm that is opaque, that is destructive. And yeah, that's it. It's important, opaque, and destructive. So it's secret. It's usually a scoring system that you don't even know you're scored by sometimes, but you definitely don't have access to the formula. You don't have a way to appeal your score, and it has power over you in some meaningful way. That's a WMD.
Thank you so much. That's such a great explanation. And I think I'd be curious to ask and build off of that, how ubiquitous are these systems?
Yeah, so as I said, like every bureaucracy that anybody ever interacts with at these touch points of their life, like trying to get a job, trying to get a loan, trying to get a college, all these things. If it's a bureaucracy that's making a decision about who gets this opportunity, who gets denied that opportunity, that's an algorithm.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the more I've learned about the ways in which these systems are used, especially, for example, in the criminal justice system, where algorithmic tools are determining whether or not an individual is granted parole, and how biased and actually inaccurate those models are. It's actually opened me up to realize, like, wow, these are literally everywhere.
That's a great example, Erica. One of the chapters in my book I devote to predictive policing. Another chapter is devoted to crime risk scores, which decide on parole and pretrial incarceration, as well as sentencing length. But the predictive policing, I mean, listen, I actually got radicalized after leaving finance and joining Occupy, like by being sort of doing a sort of data dive weekend and opening up the stop and frisk data from New York City Police Department. And I was like, stop and frisk was so racist. And there was a technology issue just to even open up the data. Like a court forced them to give the data, but they gave it to us in this format that was impossible to actually open. So we had to do some finagling with that. That's one thing. Another thing is that we were able to identify some some of the targets of the stop and frisk, like the most common targets, but we were never able to identify any of the cops because they had taken away all the information about the cops. So that's always interesting. But going to the point of going back to predictive policing was again touted as a sort of objective scientific policing. That's actually how it was described. But it just propagated this cycle of uneven racist profiling by the police. And the way they was explained was, oh, we use data to figure out where to put the cops. We use crime data to find out where to put the cops. But of course, they weren't using crime data. We don't have crime data. We have arrest data. Cops do not arrest people for every single crime that occurs. In fact, they almost never arrest people for crimes. It's like very uncommon for a crime to be an arrest to follow a crime. And I could back that up with many statistics, but that would be taking the whole hour. But the point is that like what we were actually doing was saying, hey, where did cops arrest a lot of people in the past? We're going to send cops back to those same places to arrest more people. So we were propagating racist policing and calling it scientific. It's a great example.
That's a great point. And in your book, I think you mentioned the dangers of this feedback loop that's created as a result. Let's open it up to Ian and Riley. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think, my background is I was a political science major, and obviously I just graduated from law school. So we think quite a bit about these things from a structural level. And I take Kathy's point that at the end of the day, a lot of these things are used to allocate resources, and those resources can be, effective, right, when you're talking about jobs or economic development, but they can also be oppressive in the sense of policing. And that's, obviously, again, given the moment that we're in now, it raises questions about what we've been doing for the past 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah, it's no fun when everybody agrees, I guess. So I'll agree and it. We're all victims of our experience. My experience was 17 years in and out of war zones. So that leaves one with, I think, a deep affection for functioning local government that's inclusive and respectful of the humans that they're supposed to serve, and a little bit of distrust for grand plans backed up by lots of data. And that deeply informs Canberra. Like, Naveen should be here. My CTO is a mathematician by training, but a government technologist, spent 20 years in the government. So, between the two, we sort of came together, and the first core realization we had is whatever we do has got to be deeply injected with. It has to be humanized. Machines are terrible with context. And we love telling the government, when the government asks us for AI and ML stuff, we say, we don't do AI machine learning, we just do math. And if you can't open up the box and see how it came to the conclusion, then that should be the first step in not using it.
I will just add to Ian, sorry to agree with you, Ian, but that I am very much for data, very much for collecting data, but I want to be sensitive to the idea that the way we've been doing it is that powerful people who want to keep their machinations out of sight have been secretly building these complicated algorithms and claiming that they can't possibly explain them because that's their secret sauce, and deploying them against powerless people. And then, it's just like, obviously that's going to go wrong. It has nothing to do with math, actually. It's just about the way power works. But I do think, like, if we could flip that script and have data about powerful people, that could be that is essentially the only tool that we have. And Erica, like you mentioned that we're going to talk about COVID. I mean, data is our tool, right? It is the only tool. If we don't collect the data, as we've seen, it doesn't make the problem go away. So it's in no way would I would ever suggest that we should get rid of data as a tool, or even algorithms. I'm a fan of algorithms, and I was like, maybe it was like a little bit of that, like, power of the converted, or whatever it's called, like, where I actually kind of bought into that idea that algorithms could solve problems. And so I was especially disappointed when I was like, no, it's just propagating problems. I haven't really completely given that up. I feel like maybe we could do better than this. Like, it's not like humans are perfect. Humans have bias. Maybe we could actually and very intentionally, very carefully build algorithms that are actually us but better. But it does not going to happen by accident. That's really the lesson I've learned, is that if you just do it without thinking, just do whatever the data is at your hand, and train your algorithm, it'll be just as bad as all the humans. That's why it's a reflection. It's a direct reflection of how it's been trained. So we have to actually very intentionally do better than that.
I had a question. How do you think the kind of general populace, so to speak, people who aren't kind of day to day thinking about data science and data, what are the kind of ways we can make that kind of thinking more accessible so that they have the tools to kind of question and interrogate how these systems are actually executed?
That's a great question, and that's one of the biggest ones, right? Because of this sort of intentional wielding of authority of science and mathematics. And that was actually the Riley, that's like why I wrote the book. I was like, what I want to do is empower the average person, because my book had no math in it, right? But to empower the average person to push back. You know, for example, the very first example I give in my book is like these teachers who were fired based on a score that they didn't understand and no one could explain to them. They were fired. And when they asked for more details about the algorithm, they were told it's math, you wouldn't understand it. Guess what? You have the right to ask questions about why you're being fired, especially if you're a civil servant. That's a constitutional right of due process. And that was actually what a judge found in Houston eventually. But it took a long time. So that's the kind of thing, exactly the kind of thing I want to, this is why it's advocacy, it's even activism, the kind of work I want to do. It's that as a mathematician, I'm here to tell you, mathematics isn't magic. It is something that you need to ask questions about, and you should be able to. And if you can't get answers, that's when you ask more questions.
Amazing. Yeah, very important points. I guess just to pull on that one thread, when you talk about creating systems or tools that sort of raise transparency or increase transparency on those who hold power, that might be a nice segue into the next part of our conversation about looking at cases or models that work. So I guess, prior to our call, we had talked about, are there solutions that we think really reflect the best uses of responsible ethical machine learning tools. We netted out by saying that there aren't very many that we know of. I guess if and when we create these, what do we need to know? How do we do it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll jump on it first. So we think, Camber thinks, especially in a big public health problem like COVID-19, whatever company is building stuff, disease surveillance, contact tracing apps, exposure notification, whatever it is, there has to be some, and I can talk about what I think the mechanism looks like. It doesn't have to be this, but there has to be some way to scientifically inform that process, because engineers aren't epidemiologists or researchers. And there has to be a mechanism for some kind of democratic oversight. And again, we talked earlier about that piece I wrote recently. I was self-conscious writing it because essentially what I was arguing was we need to trust tech and big government, right? Which is two absurd statements right now. But if tech can do better explaining what we're doing, I mean, everything that everyone's already said, explaining how we build the tools we build, I can't remember who said it, but the great question of asking people in power, where did you get your power? In whose interest do you exercise your power? And how do we get rid of you? It's kind of the same thing with data. Like how did you get your data? In whose interest are you exercising it? How can we delete it? There needs to be some democratic oversight of that data that's responsible to people. That's functional and not opaque. But that's a government challenge. Government has to get involved in that. There's no other way to do it. But business has to step up and start to make the case, and should be expected by people using tools to do that.
I'll add a couple examples here for us to think through. So we recently saw that IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon reduced or paused their use of facial recognition tech. And we've known for a while that companies like Palantir are used by many levels of government, along with police departments. Like, I see that there is a need to raise awareness and include the public in these conversations. But I guess, what can you do when you have large, powerful companies that do use opaque tech, and the legal mechanisms by which they're protected are very difficult to address? Riley?
Well, we're going to get to predictions. My prediction in 2020 is that's going to start to change. I mean, you're not going to see. We're a little bit of the 9/11 hangover right now. I mean, we have military police forces, for many reasons, but 9/11 certainly hit the throttle on that. We have government spending enormous amounts of money on these systems. I was going to say counterterrorism systems, but they've evolved past that. That's going to turn in 2021, I think, clearly.
Yeah, I'll add that I think, particularly as it relates to the facial recognition problem, it's an interesting dynamic, because so for context, I grew up on the south side of Chicago, where most people historically have lived in public housing and that kind of thing. You go to a place like New York, same deal. And so those systems that governments are using to surveil on the people who live there are government systems, right? Whereas you go to a place where I went for undergrad, like Columbia, or a place like NYU, there's also cameras, but those people have power, and they have the ability to kind of prevent the use of that data collection for perverse purposes. I think what will be interesting from a legal standpoint is some kind of standing around the equal surveillance of the data. And from what we've seen in this particular moment is that when you ask a community that has historically not had to deal with these challenges to deal with them, typically their response isn't to do anything differently. Their response is to kind of take it out of the environment that has been oppressed by it. So I think that'll be something interesting to see.
Yeah, I would just, I have two comments on the facial recognition thing. First, I wrote an essay for Bloomberg a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago or something. I actually audited the Department of Licensing, which is like the DMV for Washington State, on their use of facial recognition. And I was like super impressed by the way they have a very, very robust human oversight to make sure that they're not really inconveniencing people for the mistakes that we know are worse for people of color and for women and for older people. So they do a good job, to be clear. But there's no reason to think other DMVs do a good job. Moreover, in fact, I doubt they do, because the work that they put in to do a good job is very intense. Moreover, what I would say to what I keep thinking about when I hear about Boston just banned facial recognition. Well, guess what? It's not going to happen at a state level, not while the Real ID Act, which is an anti-terrorism response to Ian's point, has been changed by Congress, because it essentially requires facial recognition by the states in order to give driver's licenses with this special extra kind of identification. And basically, the way they said it to me, which I think is really profound, is like driver's licensing agencies used to be in charge of making sure that people who are driving, or trying to make sure that people who are driving were good drivers. Now they've been asked to take on the question of what is your identity? Which is a totally different question. And it's like a very secondary goal of theirs, to figure out whether you're a good driver. Like, the primary goal has become, who are you? And like, there's questions of like the fact that Washington is a sanctuary state, and like they refuse to share this data with ICE, but like other states are happy to. And like one of the requirements for the Real ID Act is that they share their data with other states. So it's like, it's a crazy system. And it's a legal system. Has nothing really to do with technology, if you will. It's really about terrorism, fears versus civil liberties in the United States. Anyway, that was the first point I wanted to make. The second point, to Riley's point, I just want to make the connection between what you just said, Riley, about the state owning all the surveillance cameras in the projects, and the thing I was saying earlier about how we don't have crime data. Like sometimes as a thought experiment to the white audiences I often speak to, I ask them like to make this point clear, like do we have crime data? Because they often think we do have crime data. I'm like, well, raise your hand if you know anyone who ever smoked pot but didn't get arrested afterwards. And they're always like, oh, okay, that's a crime. You know, like, well, that's actually not really shouldn't be a crime, first of all, but like there's a lot of missing white crime. There, you know, there's even more missing white crime than there is missing black crime. So then the thought experiment is close your eyes and imagine what it would look like if we lived in a world where we did have crime data. What would that look like? That would be like surveillance cameras everywhere, like everywhere, in your bathroom, in a hallway, in an elevator. And nobody wants to live in that world. And I'm like, oh wait, some people already live in that world, and it's the projects. Like that is actually already happening. And so if you think about it that way, you'd be like, oh, so no wonder all of our crime data, which is really arrest data, is concentrated in those neighborhoods where we actually do live in that world. And to your point, Riley, I agree with you that privileged people, when they think through that thought experiment, they don't want that to come to their neighborhood. They want to improve the lives of the kids, of the people in the project, and that is a good outcome.
Yeah, this is agreed. All right. So I guess if we think about, let's see, if we continue on this topic of how we can build better systems and better tools, and why, and who do they serve, and how do they make a difference and make an impact? Riley, I want to talk about your startup and your solution. So many people have called for creators of these tools and platforms to be more diverse and reflect their users. Your solution and your startup aims to do exactly this. Could you talk a little bit about Join the Block?
Yeah, sure. So as I said in the intro, part of what we do is help organizations that are doing workforce development. So they're helping people prepare their resumes, prepare their cover letters, prepare for interviews and that kind of thing. And so they're collecting a lot of data, but they generally a lot of times don't know how to operationalize it in a way to make decisions. I think the thing about kind of designing these tools responsibly is that, you know, to be frank, you know, even as a Black American person who has lived in a low-income community, I have certain biases just based on where I was educated and what I studied, like those kinds of things. And so, you know, it would be irresponsible of me to use the data that we collected initially from the first 2 years of our startup, which were mostly Ivy League Black kids, and apply that to people who are young people in the Bronx. And so there has to be, I think, to what both Ian and Kathy have said, we are very intentional about making sure that there's a human kind of curating and being responsive to the actual tailoring of the solution that we're using in any particular moment.
Awesome. I guess I want to ask a quick follow-up on that. How do you actually do that? Like, what is that? Like, how can we actually tailor and address like biases and data inputs? How do you address, you know, areas that you might not notice or might not see given your unique perspective that you just mentioned?
Sure. Yeah. I think the smartest way that we've done it is to talk to other people. And I'm sure we'll get to this question around like who's doing it well. I also don't know that there is anyone doing it that well, but we've worked with people like a really good mentor of mine, Rashida Richardson at AI Now, and some other folks. I took a law school class, the law of big data, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. So that was an interesting perspective because I was able to kind of get kind of resources from my school to do that, but it's a work in progress, and I don't think there's anyone doing it like perfectly, and so we kind of do the best we can and you know, try to get better over time.
Totally. I think there's a lot of opportunity in multiple ways in which you bring various stakeholders, various perspectives, lawmakers, executives, startups, you know, practitioners in all the different ways to really sort of get aligned on the mission.
Yep.
So I guess let's open it up to any thoughts or feedback on that. Like, how do we create systems and tools? Kathy, Ian, your thoughts, your perspectives.
We touched on stakeholders a little bit. From my perspective, like, and this is the way that my company Orca does its algorithmic audit, is that it invites stakeholders to the table to talk about, like, and when I say stakeholders, I mean, you think of an algorithm in a context. So it can't just be an algorithm by itself, which doesn't really have ethics, if you don't mind me saying. Like, just as a quick side point, an algorithm that predicts diabetes is like all good if your doctor has it and keeps you well, and really evil if a health insurance company uses it to keep you from being able to afford health insurance. So it's like, you really have to think of an algorithm in a context, like, how is it being used? What is the impact? And then once you have that question answered, you can say, well, who is impacted? And you can invite the stakeholders, the people who are impacted, to the conversation, at least if they're not like the environment itself. But you can have representatives of those stakeholders. So it's kind of a Rawlsian exercise, philosophical exercise sometimes. And then you say, well, what would it mean for this to fail for you? It's not a direct answer to your question, Eric, of like, how do you curate data so that it's not biased? But it ends up, interestingly, being about that. So, like, for example, you'll have people say, well, I'm afraid that people like me will not be well represented in your data set, and therefore I will be underappreciated by this risk scoring algorithm, or something like along those lines. So you end up dealing with these questions of data, of bias in data, of missing data, and all kinds of things, by simply asking the stakeholders what could go wrong from your perspective, or what could go right.
So that's stuff we feel really passionate about at Camber. So I guess the first thing is, we mentioned at the beginning, Camber is built to try to empower decision makers, government bureaucrats, right? These are the people that ensure that every day we're trying to provide for equal opportunity for everyone in their constituency and provide services. But how do they do that? How do we leverage data to help them do that? So I think the two important points that we think about. One is, you don't want machines making decisions as much as you can possibly avoid it, right? We want to build a system to empower the human that understands context with the information they need to make a better decision, which means we spend an enormous amount of time thinking about how do we get the right data set together so that we're not giving them something dirty. And so to talk about COVID-19 briefly, and I love this example. It's just too perfect. It's almost too perfect because it's a little bit cheap. But the New York Times had a story, I don't know, in April, about smart thermometers, and how smart thermometers were indicating, internet connected thermometers were indicating a decrease in abnormal temperatures, which then could be read as indicating that cases were going down. And it's just laughably obvious, the next question, which is, who owns a smart thermometer? I don't own a smart thermometer. Like, I don't know who are the people that own the smart thermometers, but they're certainly not representative. So I don't know, well, I guess I shouldn't say that. I was gonna say, I don't know of anyone else who takes the pain that we do. We take enormous pains to ensure that whatever data we're working with is inclusive. And we take extraordinary effort to ensure there are gonna be gaps. There's going to be gaps. That we're aware of those gaps and try to ensure that anyone making decisions based on our information understand that. Which is, that was just shameful self-promotion right there. It wasn't really an answer.
But Ian, who does own those thermometers? I had that same exact question when I read that article.
I have no idea.
It's so frustrating that they just acted like N equals all in that, that the thermometer company were just like, oh, we know before anybody else who's going to get sick. And I'm like, well, show me demographic profiles, man.
And, so I don't want to complain about, there have been a number of really credulous stories. And this gets a little bit of the tech hangover. Like we as humans, as Americans, made some collective decisions about tech over the last 15 years. And part of that collective decision that's most problematic is outsourcing a little bit of our thinking to it.
Yep.
And like I'll try to slow it down before I get too much of a soapbox, but I know I'm preaching to the choir in that the fact that we use any kind of algorithm for sentencing or parole is egregious. But that's because it seems like a really great idea to outsource from the biased human to the machine that is just doing math, but it's not doing math, will then provide for more universal outcomes, which of course we all know now is absolutely not the case. So I think that's generally recognized, but that kind of thinking still exists a little bit, which is what we're fighting through now.
I like to say that many of the weapons of math destruction, the worst examples, like many algorithms are not WMDs, just to be clear. There's plenty of perfectly benign algorithms that no one cares about, but many of the WMDs replace a difficult conversation that people wanted to avoid. So people want to avoid the question of what is parole for, who deserves parole. People want to avoid the question of what makes a teacher a good teacher. So they're like, instead of actually having this conversation and coming to a consensus that we're all slightly uncomfortable with, we're going to have like an algorithm come in that nobody can understand and give us a silver bullet. And that, I mean, you'd be surprised how much that matters in many of these. It's almost a political situation rather than like a mathematical one.
Riley, were you going to say something?
No, I mean, I was going to jump off of a point that Ian was making around making sure that there's a human in the loop, in the feedback loop. That's something that we take very seriously for a couple of reasons. One, for the kind of point that we've already, I think, hashed out around making sure that, you know, there's some kind of responsible oversight of the data. But two, in relation to the particular problem that Block works on, that is the exact problem around automation and unemployment that we're going to be facing, that, you know, people want to not only outsource these systems for the sake of not having a difficult conversation, but also because it allows them to cut costs in a way to eliminate a person from their budget and their line item and that kind of thing. But if you see that in our context where people are focused on preparing for jobs and preparing for employment, there is not much you can say to someone to help them prepare for an interview that's just like in a text format or even in audio, right? So there needs to be a human in that feedback loop that's able to actually to get a sense of what the other human needs. And I think that's something that we're really passionate about. So that's all.
Awesome. Yeah, that's totally a great point about the relationship between machine tools and human decision making. I think, like, you know, what I've been thinking a lot is like the ways in which who holds the tool, how it's used, like who is the user of that, the implementer of that tool will drastically impact. So that context informs you know, who's impacted. And then ultimately, I feel like it comes back to this issue of liability. So when we talk about that parole issue or all the other examples that we've talked about when it comes to assessing a teacher, assessing, you know, the many ways in which we're using these tools, I think in some ways, yes, it's avoiding difficult conversations, and maybe perhaps it's also reducing human liability. And that to me speaks.
I'm just going to back you up here. Like, it is absolutely a way of saying, wasn't my fault. The machine told me this. I mean, that it was a direct quote on many of the people I interviewed for my book was like, you know, and it's even worse than that, to be honest, because that'd be one thing if it was only being used, that line was only being used by the people within the bureaucracy who were the only ones not fired, to Riley's point, once the algorithm replaced all the humans. But it's also used by the deployers, the builders of the algorithm. I interviewed a guy who builds crime risk algorithms, recidivism risk algorithms. So trying to predict how many people will go back to prison eventually who leave. And I was like, well, do you use race as a you know, predictor? And he's like, oh no, I would never do that. That would be wrong. Well, do you use zip code? He was like, oh yes, I do, because that makes it much more accurate. I'm like, dude, that's a proxy. It's a very strong proxy in our segregated society. He's like, yeah, I know. So, well, is there anybody at the state prison system that tells you what you are or not allowed to use? And he said, oh no, they just trust me because I have a PhD. And I'm like, well, in that case, is there any kind of ethics that you take responsibility for and how your algorithms are used? And he's like, no, I just build them. They decide how to use them. So if you like put that all together, you're like, holy crap, there's nobody in charge and there's nobody responsible. And everybody, and I think he's right, by the way. I don't think he was being dishonest with me. He was being honest.
Yeah.
Like that is how it is seen. Like the PhDs in the corner are in charge of the job, the technical job. And it's only seen essentially because of this marketing as like mathematics is objective and true and big data is a miracle. Like it's only seen as a technical thing. Like the ethics issue just gets buried.
So I hope this, I'm not taking this too far afield, but just again, we're all victims of our experience. I don't know. So automated weapon systems, using AI and it's in the world already. China's developing these systems. But I don't know anyone with my background that doesn't think that's a horrible idea. And 9/10 of the reason we think it's a horrible idea is because the responsibility for it, someone has got to feel the weight of that kill if we're gonna kill somebody. And you already see it in just how over the past several years, how we use drones or munitions by some other thing. Someone doesn't feel the guilt in the same way when it's some kind of automated strike or it's some loop that's fed through an algorithm. It's different, and that is a profound thing that I think that we should remember. This is just to Kathy's point about responsibility. The minute that, and I think one of the questions should be, does this tool or machine take responsibility from someone? If the answer is yes, then we probably need to not use it.
Yeah, it's a thoughtful point and very much, I think, speaks to perhaps the sort of moment that we're in as we're all recognizing the ways in which we other and we distance and we sort of dehumanize and we separate from, I think, inherent human empathy. I'll continue on this thread where I've had several conversations with friends, and we talk about, for example, as it pertains to policing, if you just take the actions that we're seeing, and if you take away the uniform, and if you take away a lot of that context, if you just look at it as two humans, it might change your perspective. It might change what you see. But all right, so let's move to this call to action. So one of the reasons why we really wanted to raise these topics and have this amazing group of panelists participate is because we wanted to make everyday users of platforms and tools, as well as data scientists, engineers, and executives, more aware and informed about all the topics that we just talked about today. So given all that, what can folks that are working in tech do today to address the challenges that we talked about? And what are some things that they can do perhaps in the more longer term?
I have like a really, really short answer to that question and then a much, much longer answer to that question. But my very short answer is anybody who's involved at the product design level, at the business level, at the data science level, at the engineering level, should always ask, for whom will this fail?
For whom will this fail?
And that has both who are the stakeholders and what does it mean for them that it fails? It's actually kind of shocking if you just consider that one question as a litmus test for all the shit shows we have seen of like algorithmic bias, how often that it would have been enough to ask that one question. Like if you think about Joy Buolamwini and the gender shade studies on facial recognition with like Black women being seen much less accurately than white men on facial recognition, for whom does this fail? Boom. Like think through that and you're like, oh, we should run some tests to make sure it works for different skin shades. Like, duh. There's so many examples like that where a very simple question like that answered carefully would really anticipate and solve a lot of problems before they happen.
I can remember, again, being in government in 2006, 7, 8, my wife trying to explain to me what Twitter is, and like I'll be deployed and come back, and like everybody's using on like Instagram's a new thing, and I'm trying to understand, like, how is all of this helpful for, you know, this apparent supposed national effort that we're involved in. So a huge techno skeptic. And now, you know, here, 2020 in March, you know, we were part of this early tech task force with the White House, with Hanger. And I would end these calls would end, and I would find myself being the one saying, we've got to do more than this. You guys are being too cautious. Which I think really ultimately where my thinking now is to really commend the voices I've heard. And these are, you know, people from Microsoft and other companies in the Valley who've been very thoughtful and very cautious, and I think very chastened for really good reason. But what I hope doesn't happen is we don't revert the other way, where, you know, smart people that can do good things with technology don't try to come out and explain what they want to do and communicate about the tech and engage with, you know, nonprofits and you know, and government. I mean, there's tons. We all know there's scores and scores and scores of just really phenomenal nonprofits, or hundreds of really phenomenal nonprofits that would be great partners for any powerful tech company that wants to figure out how to build something that's not damaging. So I don't know that I'm answering the question so much as that I think that my sense is that there's this recognition we need to dial back some of the harmful, terrible tools that have been built. So let's take a few steps back and let's pause and think about how do we do it smarter moving forward, and then let's do it. You know, part of it is simple stuff, like just not by being more diverse. Part of it's harder stuff, you know, like really reading Kathy's book and understanding it and applying it. But all of which I'm sort of wrapping up unintentionally. But I don't think it's that hard, right? It's just engagement, just engagement.
Yeah, I don't have much to add there. I think hiring more diverse candidates is an obvious one for me, because I think about something as simple as going to the bathroom and trying to find using the sensor on the sink, and it doesn't work for me for whatever reason, right? And like how common an experience that is for my friends and family, and something as simple as that, you know, how that, you know, extrapolated to other contexts that are much more important, and how having someone on your team that understands that could change that dramatically. A question though that I had for Kathy and Ian too, is as we're talking about this and kind of, I guess, how bleak the world is, how do we unwind it? I think that's something that I've always thought about, particularly in the context of a thing like facial recognition, where I would say that in many cases we are not the progenitors of it. We're not the largest propagators of it. You know, other countries are. China, for example, uses facial recognition and other types of algorithmic decision making to give you a score and those kinds. So how do we unwind this world is something that's, I think, always top of mind for me.
Well, I have an answer, but I want to hear Ian's answer. And my answer is naive. I'm not experienced like Ian is international.
Oh, oh, good. So I'm feeling enormous pressure
No,
and foolish, very foolish at the moment. Very chastened. Second use of the word chastened.
My naive answer is that I think we should prepare ourselves for what I call a sort of an AI Cold War. That like we really see the European vision where they're like, no, we care about privacy, we care about human rights. We do not want automated decision on life or death situations. We see China, which is the absolute opposite, saying that we're going to take autocratic control over our citizens, and explicitly so. These are tools of social control. Everyone should know that. Everyone should behave well. Your score will go down. You will not be able to do the things you want to do as a citizen if we don't like what you're saying about the party, etc. They are not just doing that there. They have this whole plan and they're taking it on the road. It's like I think it's called the Digital Silk Road. They're installing these kinds of systems in other countries, where, you know, in Northern Africa, different parts of Asia. That should be seen from my perspective as a war, and it's a war on this approach that the government takes. Is the government controlling us with surveillance, or is the government using help, sort of saying, we're going to make technology work for you? And I actually think the United States is in between. I wouldn't say we're the European model or the China model. I think we have to make a choice. There, to the extent that we're the China model, we're mostly the China model through the privatized industries and the police. That's my naive take on it, though. So I'd love to hear Ian's thoughts.
Mine is every bit as naive. Well, I mean, the short answer is we need better federal leadership. There's all these great international and domestic institutions that are built to protect human rights and provide for stable international systems. So we can start with not tearing those down would be great. I think part of the demographic change is going to drive a lot of it too. I mean, things are going to be different 2050, no matter what. So that's one answer. I think really for me, and I don't know, this isn't very satisfying. And maybe part of this is just me practicing avoidance. But like local engagement to me, that's what I'm by far the most interested in. And it is my thought or hope that really getting things right locally will then propagate up to, better outcomes at state, federal level. Because but I agree with you totally about China and the threat of China. I don't have a different answer other than the international systems that were built since World War II need to be better empowered and led. And if they're not, then that's problematic.
Riley, can I ask you to answer your question too?
I genuinely, I don't think I have an answer. I think I like Ian's in terms of kind of localizing the effort to change. And I think also, yeah, better federal leadership, because I think the challenge that the United States has backed itself into is that its history does not suggest that it is necessarily the most responsible. But I think the interesting and unique dynamic about being a United States citizen is, I think we're always going to want to have a say. And so if we're going to have a say, we might as well say the right thing, I guess is my thing.
Perfect.
Love it. Yes, totally. All right. So let's move to close out our amazing conversation. Before we go, we would love to ask you, it's been quite a 2020 so far. Any fun predictions for what's left of the year or 2021? What are you excited about? What are you terrified about? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I have to admit that I'm like a hopeless optimist, in spite of being also like very dark. And I have to say that like the public sentiment on Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd protests are inspiring to me. And the way that they affect me quite directly is that the clients who I've been talking to who want their algorithms audited are starting to be willing to discuss not just can I make sure I'm not going to get in trouble, which has been the standard approach, but like, how do I make my algorithm anti-racist, which is so much more exciting, because like, as Riley I'm sure knows, like there are these things like the 4/5 rule in hiring that mean like you can be legally pretty racist, but as long as you don't go over that line. And the problem with that is that what it means is that the entire industry like optimizes to being as racist as legally possible.
Yep.
And wouldn't it be amazing if we could actually be anti-racist instead? I feel like that is now possible in a way that I don't think I could have said 2 months ago. So I'll just stop there before I think too hard about it.
Wait, what was that? What was that rule that you just, what was that? Could you unpack that a little bit? What was that 4/5 rule or?
The 4/5 rule, it's about comparing two rates. So like if you have a filtering system, like if say like you filter job candidates, people apply to jobs, and like half of them get filtered out. But if you look by the race and you say like, well, half of white people get filtered out, but actually more than half of Black people get filtered out. How much more? Well, if you compare the rates of filtering, if it doesn't exceed 4/5, or must exceed 4/5, it has to be relatively close to the same rate of filtering, but it can be 80%. Like there could be like way more, like you could have 80% survivors, Black survivors versus those. So 80 Black candidates versus 100 white candidates. That's the legal limit, if that makes sense, that survive through a filter. And it's really bad. I mean, think about it. Like that's 4/5. So you get 5 white candidates and 4 Black candidates, and that's not even addressing the question of how many Black candidates were even shown this job by the big monster.coms and LinkedIn's of the world. Those sourcing algorithms are the next frontier for like, how do we even address the racism that's very likely to be happening at that level? Riley and I obviously need to talk after this. Anyway, like my point is that like we shouldn't be surprised, but this is a thing that really matters now that so many millions of people are out of work. There's so many millions of people are going to be looking for a job. Guess where they're going to be looking for a job? Online. All this stuff is being done online. This matters. And if we could change that optimized algorithm racism to being like, instead of being pretty racist to being like not racist, that would make a big difference.
I don't have any predictions, but I will say that it has been refreshing to be able to talk about race outside of panels like these and actual and interpersonal conversations with decision makers, and have that not be a taboo subject. And so I guess the prediction that follows that might be that I think you'll start to see people actually be happy, hopefully, right? If they're actually getting the things that they're asking for, because they're responsive to those needs. So let's see. I don't know.
I'm a little bit of a hopeless optimist too. I think that this is, change is painful, but there's things on the table now that 6 months ago were inconceivable.
Yep.
So that's all good.
Awesome. Well, I guess only time will tell. I agree. I feel like I personally also feel very optimistic and hopeful for potentially, a lot of change that takes place both macro, micro, interpersonal. All right. Well, I just want to say thank you all so much for your time. We really appreciate everyone's perspective and taking the time out of their busy days to engage in this fantastic dialogue. So thank you all. And with that, we will close.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.